Hello, this is Leighton Pearce presenting Radio Sampha, brought to you by the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources. Benefits of a Sampha membership include subscription to our quarterly magazine The Cutting Edge, reduced entry fees to our annual conference, access to crop walks throughout the year. If you're interested in becoming a Sampha member, please go to www.sampha.com.au. Welcome to Radio Sampha. This is Leighton Pearce, and today we're talking again to Tom Robinson, the current president of Sampha. And today, Tom, we'd like to speak to you about controlled traffic farming.
Brilliant, thank you, Leighton.
How long ago did you set up your system in controlled traffic farming, and on what spacing are you at, and how did you get into it?
Controlled traffic has been definitely a step-by-step for us. We first started with the sprayer and also with the spreader. So we just thought we're just going to run these down the same track. And that started 6 years ago now for us, just the sprayer and the spreader. And that was the first thing we thought. You know, those are the passes where it's very, very wet and the most soil compaction happens on our farms. And so then 4 years ago, we stretched the seeder. That's when we went to 6-inch row spacings. We took the joules off an MX 240 front wheel assist tractor, and we took it out to 3 metre centres. What I'm running at the moment is we're running a 33 1/3 foot controlled traffic system. So I'm running a 33 1/3 foot seeder and harvester, and I'm running a 100-foot boom spray. And that's probably the only thing I can recommend to guys is just choose something simple to start with. I like that we went to control traffic, but if I had my time again, we would have been either on 30 feet or 40 feet. Just try and make it simple that when you change machinery over, those next machinery purchases can be done easily. Or if you need to get a contractor in, you can find a contractor with a 40-foot front or a 30-foot front. We do run a 35-foot front on our controlled traffic and just overlap just a little bit. But for guys that are getting into it, just start somewhere. Have an idea. It doesn't need to be all done in 1 year. Start with a seeder or start with a sprayer. You know, I've seen work out of New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland where they say get the header on it first. Well, we're so dry here in November, December, we don't often see harvester traffic in crop. So, you know, let's think about when the soils are wet and when we're trafficking them. So that's seeding time, spraying time and spreading time. But just start somewhere. For us, it was the logical next step after zero-till. You know, and I think that the zero-till has done so much for us with the soil health and all that. But it's nice now to know we're controlling our traffic, and it just adds to the zero-till. It's just another benefit.
So tractors are on tracks. You're using an SP sprayer. What else are you adopting? Is your harvester on tracks yet?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So we have a new harvester for 2015, which matched up all our controlled traffic now. So all the harvesting operation is now on full controlled traffic. So I'm running a harvester on tracks with my 35-foot stripper front. I have a row track tractor on tracks. That's my main seeding tractor. That's on 120 centres or 3 metre centres. That does my spreading as well, so we put a spreader on the back of that. And then during the harvest time, that tractor will run a grain cart as well. So my main seeder tractor is sort of my all-purpose tractor. It does 3 things. But then we've also got another tractor on wheels that's a sort of a yard tractor, but that's also on 3 metre centres. So it just takes time to get stuff there. You know, when you're thinking about your next machinery purchase, just think about how can I make that fit into a controlled traffic system. So my wheel tractor has what we call cotton reels made up by my local engineer. He made me up some cotton reels to get that tractor on the 3 metre centres. But there's lots of aftermarket products that guys can use to get out to that 120-inch or 3 metre centres.
Have you reached a point that you have to renovate your track?
Yeah, they definitely have compressed. They've compressed normally 3 to 4 inches, I suppose, in normal traffic. But mainly they've only compressed where the sprayer goes. So my middle tram lines where the harvester and the seeder go, I'm not having to renovate them. It's basically when I'm spraying in not very good conditions after a rain and that sort of stuff. That's where I normally run into trouble. Yeah, we have renovated a few. I try and do it as delicately as possible, but sometimes you've just got to go and fix them. You know, it's hard to do, but you've just got to go and fix them if they're really rough.
And nobody drives across your paddocks?
No, we do a lot of walking for crop monitoring and stuff like that. Later in the season, like from now onwards, we'll actually take our SP boom spray and we will go and do crop monitoring in the SP boom spray. I know it's putting hours up on it, but that way we can run down our tram lines and have a look at the back of the paddock and things like that. But no utes or anything like that. We can still see compaction from semi-trailers before we got onto controlled traffic. So I've got one paddock that's sand over clay. We can see a nutrient deficiency in our crop where a semi-trailer drove 10 years ago.
Well, thank you very much for giving us the information on your controlled traffic system, and look forward to talking to you again in the future, Tom.
Brilliant. Thank you, Leighton.
If you subscribe to Radio Santha through iTunes, don't forget to provide a rating and a review on the iTunes website for Radio Santha.
Welcome to Radio Santha. Today we're talking to Dr. Rick Llewellyn about the publication Impact of Weeds on Australian Grain Production. This publication has been put together by Rick Llewellyn from the CSIRO, David Ronning and Michael Clark from Ag Econ Plus, Alan Mayfield from Alan Mayfield Consulting, Steve Walker from UniQuest, the University of Queensland, and Jackie Usman from the CSIRO. Welcome to Radio Santha, Rick.
Hello.
This is quite an extensive book publication that you've put together. Why has there been such a requirement for a book to be put together?
Well, it's something that the GADC asked us to do. There hasn't been a study like this for well over 10 years, and it's a chance to take a bigger picture view of the cost of weeds across Australia, which of course is one of the big investment areas for GADC and also, of course, one of the big costs for Australian grain growers. So
how did you go about collecting the information that's made up the report?
Well, what this report's all about is going down to the farm level as well as looking at some of the big market costs. So we spoke to over 600 farmers right around Australia in all the grain growing regions. And we also spoke to a large number of consultants right around Australia to get some of the extra local information. And then on top of that, we've got a lot of the statistics around the areas of different crops grown and various practices.
So it's titled The Impact of Weeds on Australian Grain Production. So what is the cost of weeds to grain production?
Well, if you do just want the big figure is around $3.3 billion. That's what weeds cost Australian grain growers. And that includes a whole range of different things. So it includes the direct cost of weeds on yield, and it includes the management costs, the whole range of management costs around weeds, which includes the application costs. So a whole lot of costs of herbicide, non-herbicide factors, some costs that farmers or agronomists perhaps don't always consider, but we've factored in here. And there's also the cost of contamination and cleaning costs, which is relatively minor, but it's also included here. So it's the full cost of weeds sort of brought together and broken down in this study.
So what weeds are costing us the most amount of money?
Yeah, well, if you think nationally, first of all, when you look at the national figures, I guess there are no real surprises. The big weeds, it's ryegrass, wild radish, wild oats, and then brome grass, which is one that has snuck up there in the last decade, further up the ranking. So they're the big four, and a lot of the reason for that is that it's so extensive. A weed like ryegrass is such an extensive weed that the costs accumulate very quickly.
So what implications are there for farmers?
Well, the big issue here is out of that big cost of $3.3 billion, by far the largest chunk of that is the management cost. So quite obviously it's the management cost of weeds is the big factor. So by that I mean it's not necessarily the yield loss. Farmers are actually shown to be doing a very good job of keeping weed numbers low, and that is confirmed also by the paddock surveys that various research groups do around Australia when they visit paddocks. So weed numbers in general are being well controlled by farmers. In this study, there's only around 10 or 12% of paddocks were sort of deemed to be with high weed loads at the end of the year. So the big issue is how do you keep these costs down? Because farmers are willing to keep weed numbers down, but it's coming at a great cost. And of course, the other factor in there is herbicide resistance, which is potentially adding to that cost. So there's a whole range of things to consider in how to keep costs down. And the important part of this study, which hasn't been considered extensively in other studies, is the cost of fallow weed management. So fallow weed management is a big cost, but it's also a big part of that yield loss as well. So the opportunities to improve fallow weed management to reduce weed costs is a big one.
So you've looked at a number of different ways of weed eradication and their costs to farmers. Mechanical versus chemical, is it showing any differences there in the cost to the industry?
Well, there's no question that herbicides are the big big cost when it comes to managing weeds and the application of herbicide cost as well when you consider the number of passes involved, particularly when you consider fallow. So that's a big part of it. But what we're seeing is some interesting results on how far there is to go in terms of adopting non-herbicide practices or integrated weed management practices. So if you look at Western Australia, for example, they're a long way ahead in terms of the amount spent on non-herbicide practices, and that's because they're a long way ahead in terms of herbicide resistance development as well. But it does show with practices like seed catching, narrow windrow burning, and some of these other practices that there are other regions that can still use these practices to a much greater extent, and we're only just seeing that now. So some of the regions in the southern part of Australia starting to see that rapid uptake of something like narrow windrow burning, which is already up to around 70% use in some parts of Western Australia.
Have you analysed the cost of no-till versus conventional in terms of the cost of weeds to those farmers?
Around 30% of farmers doing some cultivation for weed control purposes. So that's a big area being cultivated, and there's some indication that that's increasing, and that's including fallow weed control as well.
So obviously with other mechanical choices of weed eradication, it's going to open up the opportunities for farmers to maybe not cultivate in the future?
Yeah, well, there's always, herbicides have allowed, of course, over the last 2 decades, there's been a massive reduction in cultivation. So herbicides have allowed that to happen, and good weed controls exists despite that big fall in cultivation. But what we are seeing is some selective use of cultivation. So farmers are showing a high degree of flexibility in Australia on how they use no-till, and they're showing a willingness to use some cultivation where needed. And some of these weeds are becoming quite tricky to control, and they are starting to demand some other physical practices.
Are we expecting the cost of weed control to escalate over the next few years, or where's that headed?
And overall, herbicide costs have actually come down. If you look at the cost of inputs, it might not always seem that way, but on average, the big challenge is how to integrate some of these other practices into a sustainable system.
Yeah. It's a great report. It's got about 108 pages of many tables and a lot of information and graphs. Given the Reader's Digest version of the book, Rick, what big figures can you throw at us, I guess, in terms of for farmers so they can get it as a Reader's Digest version?
The farmer was wanting to sort of dive in. You're better off looking at the individual region figures, because the national figures do show the big picture, but it's when you start to look at some of the individual weeds that are having an impact in different regions, you might be able to get a feel for what's sort of coming through as a potential threat in neighbouring regions. So there's some interesting figures there, and some of these summer weeds are certainly on the rise in terms of their cost, and some of the northern type summer weeds, such as fleabane and panic and species like this windmill grass, sort of starting to come through and show what a potential threat they could be. And the other thing is, it's really hard to make general recommendations on management from national figures. It's not until you get down and look at something like the economic importance of Lincolnweed in an area like the Upper EP, Mallee type environment that you see just how important localised weed issues can be.
So where do farmers, researchers, funders go to get a copy of the report and find out the details of it?
Well, it's on the GRDC website. If you go to GRDC website and look for the impact of weeds, you'll see the report sitting there. GRDC have done a great job publishing the version there.
Okay, once again, thank you very much for Rick Llewellyn to come into the studios today and be interviewed by Radio Sanford.
Thank you.
Benefits of a SANFA membership include subscription to our quarterly magazine, The Cutting Edge, reduced entry fees to our annual conference, access to crop walks throughout the year. If you're interested in becoming a SANFA member, please go to www.sanfa.com.au. Thank you for listening to Radio Sanford, the voice of agriculture.